Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host today, Ms. Linda Abrazizi. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you, and good morning for those of you joining on the East and West Coast. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on export clearance and records. I am pleased to note that we have more than 46 people registered for this webinar today. My name is Linda Abrazizi. I am an International Trade Specialist for the Marketing Communications Office for the U.S. Commercial Service at the Department of Commerce. This webinar is being brought to you in cooperation by the U.S. Commercial Service and the Bureau of Industry and Security. And I would like to welcome all participants in the export community who are joining us all across the United States to learn about the Export Administration Regulation requirements. You will learn about license numbers or other authorization requirements, as well as destination control statements on your shipping documents in this webinar. In addition, you will learn about the specific requirements about who is responsible for keeping records of export transactions and what records must be kept. In a moment, I'll turn this presentation over to William Arvin, who is the Export Policy Analyst for the Regulatory Policy Division for the Bureau of Industry and Security. William will be available at the end of this presentation to answer your questions. Contact information will also be provided. Now, for those of you who just joined, you can still log into this webinar by entering the URL website and passcode per instructions that were sent to you by email. We do have a few housekeeping details to make sure everyone gets the most benefit from this morning's webinar. You are able to hear this presentation via your telephone and view it simultaneously via your computer. So if you are not hooked up through both, please take a moment to do this. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please press *0 anytime during this presentation. We will be taking written and voice questions. To ask a written question, we do invite you to type your questions on your screen as they occur to you. On the upper left-hand side of your computer, there is an icon with the letters Q and A. If you put your mouse cursor on that icon, you can ask a question in the fields provided. Type questions. We will compile these questions and present them as many as time allows. Type questions which are not answered during this webinar due to time constraints will receive a personal answer via email afterwards. In addition, we will allow you to ask for voice questions. To ask a voice question, please press *1 and the operator will assist you. Also, for those of you who want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation slides from this webinar, on the upper right-hand side there is an icon. This icon looks like there are 3 sheets of paper overlapping one another. If you place your mouse's cursor over this icon, you can actually download the PowerPoint presentation slides to your desktop or to another folder. In addition, all listeners will be provided with any information for any individual follow-up counseling or expert assistance or market research. And for those of you who just logged on, you can still join in our Internet conference. And now I'd like to introduce live online the Export Policy Analyst for the Regulatory Policy Division for the Bureau of Industry and Security, William Arvin. William, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning. Glad to be here. Glad to be talking to all of you today. This is actually one of the more, obscure topics in the Export Administration Regulations, export clearance requirements. And I guess at the outset, I should probably mention that the export clearance requirements of the Export Administration Regulations are actually only a small part of the various export clearance requirements the U.S. government imposes. Most of those requirements are in the foreign trade regulations administered by the Census Bureau. And if you have certain questions or questions that go beyond what's in the Export Administration Regulations, it's going to have to be the Census Bureau that you contact for those. Just at the outset, their telephone number is 1-800-549-0595. But to begin, the topics we're going to be talking about today is the use of the AES, that's Automated Export System record. Again, that is something that's put together by the Census Bureau and by Customs for automatically recording export data or electronically recording export data. It may not be quite as automatic as some people wish. We're going to talk about responsibilities for determining export license requirements and obtaining export licenses in both what we call the standard export transaction and the routed transaction, a little bit about situations in which your shipping documents have to conform and be consistent with similar statements on export licenses, destination control statement, a statement that's used to inform foreign parties of the existence and possible applicability of the Export Administration regulations, certain instances when you're allowed to make non-material changes to the license, things you can do that are not exactly to the letter with what's written on the license, and you do not have to contact BIS to make those types of changes. And finally, wrapping up with shipping tolerances. Shipping tolerances being certain instances when you have a shipment under an export license wherein you can ship somewhat more or a little bit more than what was actually specified on the license. We begin the AES record automated export system. It is a statistical document, but it's also an export control document. It's used by the Bureau of Industry and Security and by Customs for administering export control laws. False statements on the record could be a violation of the Export Administration regulations, can also be a violation of potentially other federal statutes as well. When you're transmitting that data, you're certifying certain things, and these are specified in Section 758.1 of the Export Administration regulations. First of all, that it is a properly authorized export. It's either permitted under the Export Administration regulations without a license, no license required. There's some license exception that authorizes it, or you've obtained a license that properly authorizes this particular shipment. You're also committing that the statements conform with any license that's been issued by BIS. The parentheses there mentions a possible exception for routed transactions. We'll go into that in a little bit when we talk about routed transactions and responsibilities, but there's some instances where the AES record might require you to do some, or the Census AES regulations might require you to do something a little bit different than what's required for license application responsibilities under the Export Administration regulations. And of course, the thing you have on just about everything you send to the government, you're certifying the information is true, accurate, and complete. Okay, first thing, again, as I said, we'll be talking a bit about the portions of export clearance that are governed by the Export Administration regulations. And one is, when do you include the export control classification number on the AES record? That's really governed by the EAR. It's again, and if your shipment is under a license, you have to include the export control classification number. Just about all license exceptions. The TMP, return of unwanted foreign origin commodities, that would be a situation in which you've imported something into the United States. It turns out that it is not the thing that you wanted. You're returning it to the place from which you got it. We don't make you figure out what the export control classification number is for that returned item if it's validly going out under license exception TMP, because it's a returned unwanted foreign origin item. Don't have to put the ECCN in. And it says all license, no license required exports except things controlled only for anti-terrorism or EAR 99. In real life, of course, that exception is somewhat bigger than the rule. Almost all exports going out of the United States are NLR and EAR 99, probably something on the order of 95 or 98%. So although many people do include ECCNs on those types of shipments, as a technical matter, they're not actually required by the regulations. This, I am told, is an example of the AES Direct form. And some of you may be using AES Direct where you enter the data manually. I guess there are a lot of other companies, though, that actually transmit their data to Census electronically and don't manually enter the data in the form. But if you are using the AES form, that's where the export license number goes. If it's a shipment under an export license, you would be including that number. Or, again, if it is a shipment under a license exception, you would include the license exception symbol, or if no license is required, just put in the abbreviation NLR. Similarly, with the export control classification number, that's where you would put it on the form if you were submitting the data via AES Direct. Again, ECCN required for shipments under a license and for shipments under most license exceptions, again, not at TMP when you're returning unwanted origin commodities, unwanted foreign origin commodities. And if the shipment is NLR and it is an ECCN that has any reason for control other than AT, anywhere in the in that ECCN, you have to put the ECCN on the AES record. Who's responsible? Well, basically anybody who's participating in the transaction would have some responsibility in terms of making truthful statements, in terms of supplying the correct information. An agent who's filling out the form certainly is responsible for getting the information that they've received from their principal, transmitting it correctly. You cannot eliminate your own responsibility merely by hiring an agent or delegating authority. I guess the lesson there is be very careful to whom you delegate authority. They may be committing a violation, but again, if they're acting on your behalf, you may be responsible in addition to the government, or responsible in an enforcement case because of something your agent did that was not in accordance with the regulations. We talked a little bit about responsibilities of the parties. I mentioned we were going to talk about standard versus routed transactions. One thing that's important to bear in mind when we're talking about this is the Bureau of Industry and Security deals with responsibilities of the parties in this section 758.3. We're dealing with who is responsible for obtaining a license, who's responsible for determining whether a license is required. There are Census Bureau foreign trade regulations that deal with a similar topic and basically the same topic, but those regulations deal with who's responsible for filing, submitting, making sure the information is correct on the AES form. So even though the two regulations are using similar terminology, they're really covering different aspects of the export transaction. And a lot of times people get confused. They'll sort of get the two mixed up and try to apply the census rule to BIS or BIS to the census, and that's where the problem is. So it's important to maintain that distinction. In this 758.3, we're really talking about who's responsible for determining whether you need an export license and who's responsible for getting the license. We start with what we call the standard transaction, and that's typically one where the U.S. seller is dealing with a foreign buyer. U.S. seller is sort of picking the freight forwarder or the agent and selling to the foreign buyer. In that transaction, the U.S. seller is responsible for determining whether a license is required and is responsible for obtaining the license. Routed transaction is a little bit different. Routed transaction, the foreign buyer is usually the foreign principal party in interest. That party is sort of determining who the freight forwarder will be, is kind of picking the route of the transaction. In that routed transaction, the U.S. seller, the U.S. principal party in interest, is still responsible for determining whether a license is required and obtaining the license if necessary, with one exception. The only time the U.S. principal party in interest is not responsible for determining the license requirement and obtaining the license is when the U.S. principal party in interest obtains from the foreign principal party in interest a written document in which the foreign principal party in interest expressly assumed responsibility for determining if a license is required and for obtaining the license. By that method, the U.S. principal party in interest can shift that responsibility to the foreign principal party in interest, and it would be the foreign principal party in interest agent located in the United States, usually going to be the freight forwarder, who would have to then submit the license application. In that instance, you can also have a situation where for AES filing, because the AES would still look at, the Census Bureau would still look at that U.S. seller as being the exporter, that would be a different exporter than the one who would be listed on the application, because the agent of the foreign principal party in interest in that instance would have been listed as the U.S. exporter on the license application. It's kind of a little bit complicated. The main things to remember is the U.S. principal party in interest, usually that's going to be the U.S. seller who's dealing with the foreign buyer, is always responsible for determining if a license is required and obtaining the license unless he gets a commitment in writing from the foreign principal party in interest in which the foreign principal party in interest expressly assumes that responsibility. Conformity of documents, again, if there are documents, license has been issued by BIS, the documents that the information you submit in AES has to be consistent, and the information on the bill of lading or airway bill has to be consistent with the license. And again, there can be that one exception where the exporter name would be different in a routed transaction where the foreign principal party in interest had obtained the license, even though Census may want you to continue to put the U.S. seller as the exporter on the AES record. Destination control statement is kind of a formality. Purpose of the destination control statement is to alert parties who are participating in the transaction, carriers, forwarders, customs, whoever, that the regulations, the Export Administration's regulations apply. That's the statement that's there. You could add to it if you wanted to, but that's sort of the minimum statement that has to be on the documents that accompany the shipment. Where do you put that destination control statement? Well, again, it's document. Remember, the purpose is to alert people who are participating in the transaction. So you put the destination control statement on the invoice or airway bill, the bill of lading, documents that accompany the shipment. Don't need to put the destination control statement on the automated export system filing. We hope that the U.S. government knows that the export control documents or that the Export Administration regulations apply, so you don't really need to tell us that. When do you have to put it on? If it's an item other than an EAR 99 item, anything on the Commerce Control List with a specific ECCN, you have to use the destination control statement, except when you're under license exception GFT. That's typically gift parcels, individual gift parcels, or bag. That would typically be your personal baggage or your household goods when you're going under leaving the United States and using a license exception to ship your personal baggage or household goods. Switch gears here a little bit. When you have a license that's been issued by the Bureau of Industry and Security, there are some instances where the transaction or the terms of the transaction change after the license has been issued. In some instances, that can actually affect the eligibility of the transaction. Sometimes people even have to come in for a new license. That said, though, there are some instances where it does not, or where that change would not affect the eligibility, and you can actually just go ahead and proceed with the transaction without even having to notify BIS. The complete list of those transactions in which you can do so are there in Section 750.7, paragraph C. These are probably the ones that are most frequently used. I think there's actually about 8 or 10 altogether that are in that paragraph. But again, a decrease in the unit price or the total value of the shipment, don't need to do anything, don't need to notify BIS. Change in the intermediate consignee if the new intermediate consignee is located in the same country as the ultimate consignee. The change in the address of the purchaser or ultimate consignee if the new address is located within the same country shown on the license, and an increase in price or quantity that's permitted under the shipping tolerance provisions. And we'll go into shipping tolerances here on the next slide. There are a few instances in which you can actually ship more under a license than was specifically authorized under the license. And they fall into sort of 3 basic rules, and they depend on the units that are in the export control classification number that your product is classified under. If you look at that export control classification number, you start out at the beginning, you got, I think, a header, and you've got some information about license requirements, then the next header that says something about license exceptions, and then you got something about list of items controlled, and right under that list of items controlled, I think the first item you would see, the first name you would see would be units. Those units will either be value or dollar value, it'll be number, or it'll be some unit of area, weight, or measure, like kilograms or square meters or something like that. If that ECCN, if that items paragraph says dollar value, then you have no shipping tolerance. You're limited to the dollar value that's on the license. If the that units line there on the ECCN says number, you have a shipping tolerance for dollar value, but not for the number of items. And the shipping tolerance for the dollar value is 25% of the value that's listed on the license. So in effect, say due to a price increase over the life of the license, if that item was licensed by number, you could only ship the number that were licensed, but you could ship up to 25% more than the dollar value that was listed on the license. Items that are listed by area, weight, or measure, it says shipping tolerance available here on the slide. Doesn't tell you much about what it is. It's actually kind of a hybrid of the other two. If it's licensed by area, weight, or measure, the value could exceed the list, the value on the license by 25%. But in addition, the area or weight or measure, the quantity shipped, is kind of a little more complicated rule. It says that you can ship up to an additional 10% of the unshipped balance. So let me sort of illustrate that. If you had a license that was issued for 100 kilograms of something, and you've already shipped 90 kilograms, then that 10% of your unshipped balance would be 1 kilogram. Your license was issued for 100, you've shipped 90, there's 10 that haven't been shipped. You could, in that final shipment, go to a total of 11 kilograms. Again, though, for value, the same rule, the total value shipped under the license couldn't be more than 25% greater than what was the original value on the license. That one's kind of a complicated rule. If you actually do get into that situation where you're near the end of a license or near the end of the eligibility, you may want to give us a call and work through to see if you are actually able to ship a little bit more than what was authorized on the license. Before we go to the summary, I think in the introduction there was some mention that I was going to be talking a little bit about record-keeping requirements. There aren't any slides here on record-keeping requirements, but again, talk a little bit about them. In general, documents that you create or that you receive in the normal course of your business relating to your export transaction are required to be kept under the Export Administration regulations. Documents are required to be kept in their original form. If they're originally paper, you got to keep the paper. If they're originally electronic, you got to keep the originally, electronic regulations. There are specific rules if you are going to destroy the originals and retain only copies, and those rules mainly pertain to legibility and retrievability of the copies. You'll probably want to read them closely if you do plan to totally destroy your original documents or your original records. But if you're keeping them in the form in which you created them or received them, you shouldn't have a problem there. The record retention period is 5 years. That 5 years begins to run when you have any export or re-export or any diversion of the item that you know about. So, for example, let's say you receive an export license today. You don't make the shipment until 6 months from now. You make another shipment 2 months after that, and you make your last shipment under the export license a year from today. Your 5-year period for transactions related to that license would actually start to run when you made the last shipment, which in that case would be a year after you received the license and probably even a longer period of time before you made the application. In addition, if the government asks you for a record or subpoenas a record or enforcement agents want to see a record, even if the record retention period is passed, you can't destroy a record after the government has asked you to produce it. And Okay, last slide. Here is our summary. Again, the AES record is a legal document. False statements can be violations of the EAR and even of other statutes as well. Remember that as a party to the transaction, you're responsible for compliance. Even if you obtain or hire an agent to act for you, you may be responsible for the actions of the agent. Information on export control documents has to be consistent with what's in the license. There may be, again, that one exception where we have slightly different definitions there in the export administration regulations and the Census foreign trade regulations. And final one, destination control statement required for the export of all items except EAR 99. And with that, I'll ask, are there any questions?
Okay, great. Thank you, William. And to ask a voice question, please press *1 on your telephone. To ask a voice question, please press *1. And I'll turn this over to the operator.
Thank you, ma'am. One moment while we wait for questions. Once again, to ask a question, press *1. And, ma'am, at this time, I'm showing no audio questions.
Okay, we do have a written question, and it's from Kimberly Holmes. The question is regarding routed transactions. If after the FPPI provides the letter of indemnity, assuming responsibility for the export review, they decide not to proceed according to the letter, will the USPPI be held responsible? Should we use specific Incoterms to limit routing by the FPPI?
All right. Actually, I guess there are a couple of questions headed in there. I assume we're talking about after the foreign principal party in interest provides the documents, assuming the responsibility for determining the license requirements, and then they decide not to determine the license requirements or decide not to get the license. Will the USPPI be held responsible? And the short answer to that question is it depends. Certainly, if the USPPI is aware that a license is required and then continues to export knowing there's no license that's been obtained, they would certainly be responsible for that. And the fact that the foreign PPI agreed to take responsibility for obtaining the license in that instance would not take the responsibility off the USPPI's hands. Assuming, though, I guess as far as the USPPI knew, the license had been obtained. The foreign principal of party in interest had never done anything or said anything to let the USPPI know that they didn't get the license. After all, the USPPI ships to the foreign party's agent or the foreign principal party in interest U.S. agent. Then again, the regulations are clear that responsibility for having gotten the license was assumed by the USPPI in writing, and that would have been the party responsible for getting the license. So the USPPI really would not be responsible in that instance unless they continued to act with knowledge that a violation was going on. Should you use specific Incoterms to limit routing by the FPPI? That's really not a question that's governed by the Export Administration regulations. You may want to, particularly if you had, say, the other situation where you were responsible for getting the license, but certainly using Incoterms, if they would limit the routing of the transaction in a way that made sure that they conformed with the AR, might be to your advantage, but the Export Administration regulations don't really require you to use specific terminology in governing either routing or risk of loss or any of those types of things that Incoterms typically address.
Okay, great. Let me see if we have any more written questions here. Next question here is from Mariela Castro. What is the time period you will need to keep export files that are EAR 99?
Okay. You have an export of an EAR 99 item. Your time period would begin to run when the shipment is exported, or if you were the re-exporter, it was when it was re-exported, or if you knew that the shipment had been diverted somehow, your time period would begin to run when that known diversion took place. But if you're shipping, say, an EAR 99 item from the United States to Mexico, normally your 5-year period for keeping the documents related to that shipment would begin to run on the day you shipped the product to Mexico.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to open up the telephone lines one more time for voice questions. If you have a voice question, please press star 1. I would highly recommend that you take advantage of this opportunity to ask a voice question. We do have William here. Usually this conference this information is part of a 2-day conference, and it's quite lengthy, but we're condensing them into 1-hour webinars. So please take advantage of this time and ask Will personally. And to ask a question, just press star 1.
And, ma'am, we do have a few questions. The first question is from Patty. Your line is open.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you could cite a part of the regulation that outlines specifically what records are required to be retained, what export records are required to be retained.
Okay. Question is what export records are required to be obtained?
Retained.
Retained. Yes, retained. You're right. It is a record retention requirement, not a record creation requirement. And the section is 762.2 of the Export Administration Regulations. For those who use U.S. code, that would be 15 CFR 762.2.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
And next we have a question from Jean. Your line is open.
Good morning. I have a question in regards to record keeping the originals. If we send out an end-use certificate via electronic email and we receive it back electronically, do we need to ask for the originals to come in, or can we just keep the emails?
Okay. We're talking about end-use certificates. You may have a requirement to keep the originals. I think on some of those end-use certificates, you have a requirement that you can't actually ship until you get a copy of the original. Certainly, if you're dealing with one of those where you would get the original, then you're going to have that paper document you'd have to keep. If it's one where you're not required to get a paper document in the first place, then that electronic document you get would be, in effect, your original, and that's what you would be obligated to keep.
Determines if you need the originals. Is that just an internal export compliance thing, or is that something governed by one of the government bodies?
In the case of the Export Administration Regulations, it can be governed by parts, essentially a couple of sections in Part 748. You'd want to look at 748.14 and 748.13. No, I'm sorry, 748.10 and 748.14. And one other one, 748.11. 748.10, 748.11, and 748.14 deal with certain documents you sometimes have to obtain from the customer. If one of those sections requires you to get the paper original, that would be the one where you would, because you got the paper original, the record-keeping section would then require you to keep the paper original. If the section allows you to get the document electronically as an attachment to an email, for example, then that's all you would be required to keep. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And at this time, I'm showing no further questions over the phone.
Okay, we'll go back to the written questions and see if we have any more. Also, William, I have a question for you. What is the best way for the audience to get in touch with you if they want to ask additional questions or they have any more questions on this topic?
Okay. Getting in touch with me or possibly one of my colleagues in the Regulatory Policy Division, there's the main number for general information from BIS is 202-482-4811. In the Regulatory Policy Division, where we deal with questions that are regulation specific, You can get us at 202-482-2440, or you could send an email to rpd2, the number 2, at bis.doc.gov. That's RPD stands for Regulatory Policy Division, the number 2, at bis.doc.gov. We work on a weekly rotation where each week one person within the Regulatory Policy Division is responsible for answering the emails coming in requesting advice. So you can get to us in either of those two ways.
Great. Thank you, William. Next question here from Patty Brown. In an AES filing by a forwarder, your company is listed as the U.S. PPI, but you do not have the ability to access the filing for review. Will this ever change?
Okay. Will this ever change? AES filing. This is one of those questions that's actually governed by the regulations of the Census Bureau. My understanding from talking to people out there at their headquarters in Suitland is that particularly in a routed transaction, if the filing was by a forwarder picked by the foreign PPI, you do have a right to at least get a copy of the filing from the forwarder. I guess your question extends more to, can you log on to AES and view what the forwarder filed on your behalf? And that's a question I'm going to have to ask you to refer to the Census Bureau. They're the ones who actually develop AES and control it, and I really don't know the answer to that one.
Okay, do you know the Census Bureau?
That would again be 1-800-549-0595.
Okay, well then we'll open this one more time for voice questions, and if we have no more voice questions, then we'll conclude this webinar.
And once again, to ask a question over the phone, press star 1. And ma'am, I'm showing no further questions.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That looks like that's all the questions we currently have. I would like to thank everybody for participating, and also to our main speaker here, William Arvin, for his expertise. Also, I'd just like to remind everybody that if they check out the www.bis.doc.gov, which is the Bureau of Industries and Security's website, you will find information on this and other topics. Also, please check out the U.S. Commercial Services website at www.export.gov, where you will find out about upcoming webinars and other international events that are also occurring. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and please check your emails for more information on upcoming webinars and events. Goodbye.
And this does conclude today's conference. All parties may disconnect at this time.